Great, thank you. Okay, so now let's go to questions from the audience. Dorothea?
Hi. I don't know if is this on?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm Deborah Peel. I'm a physician in the most privacy-sensitive specialty in medicine, psychiatry, and I'm a Freudian analyst. And in 2004, I founded Patient Privacy Rights, which is the nation's leading advocacy organization for people who want to control their health information in electronic systems. And I also lead the bipartisan coalition for patient privacy, which represents about 10.3 million Americans. And I found this discussion about cybersecurity fascinating because I'm not clear that our government understands the cybersecurity risks posed by the build-out of the new health information technology system. And Ross, of course, was one of the speakers at the first International Health Privacy Summit that we held here on Monday. And we did have, Tim, we had many top government officials, but I think we needed to have you. We had HHS and SAMHSA and VHA and DOD, but I think that the security threats with health information may not be well understood. You know, so for example, you talked about having the information to the right person at the right time in the right place. And as Ross talked about, the kind of systems we're building are not architectured to be able to protect data in that way. In fact, the government's goal, and this is a bipartisan goal, is that every American will have an electronic record by 2014, and it will be data mined for many, many reasons. There are many, many kinds of data that the government, state and federal, are requiring collection for. They're going to be releasing public database sets that are not adequately protected. And I'm wondering, particularly this question is for you, Tim, does the national security and intelligence community understand what it means when the most intimate information about everyone is available through systems where, first of all, the security protections are really quite abysmal. Probably 80% even now of healthcare organizations don't even encrypt. And then secondly, where the individual has no right to control their information anymore because in 2002, the requirement to get consent before data is used for routine purposes was eliminated under HIPAA. And so is this not a national security threat that Americans' most personal information is you know, really not under our control, is under the control now of what are called covered entities. Everything from a solo physician like me to Hospital Corporation of America to insurance companies. We think that there are somewhere upwards of 4 million covered entities, all of whom can then share the data, and the data flows outward because there's no way to know where it goes, and there's not even a data map.
So I think there were a lot of questions in there, but I'll take a couple of them. First, I think there's the question of, I try to define the difference between, and I know they're related, what we has decided through HIPAA, through legislation and other things that we expect are the appropriate uses of data. And that can often be extremely controversial because obviously, you know, the medical industry is going to want widespread use for its purposes. Patient privacy advocates are going to want much narrower use. So that, I think, is a somewhat distinct question of, once we've decided what is okay, and we can debate that, how do we actually enforce those rules, and how do we make sure that those uses that we've decided are okay, which maybe are too broad in some people's view or too narrow in others, are being enforced? I would say that the national security establishment is probably more aware than much of the rest of the government as to what the threats are to privacy in the use of personal or other kinds of sensitive data on computer networks, precisely because, both because they suffer the kind of attacks that we just heard about in the NPR story, and also, quite frankly, because that's our job. We're intelligence agencies. We go out and gather data. That's not a secret, although the way in which you do it is. And so one of the big things, one of the reasons that those agencies can supply useful technical assistance for defensive purposes, and in fact, the NSA, for example, has a defensive mission with respect to national security systems, is because they figure, well, we know how we do it. We figure that our best adversaries probably can do it to us if we have the same kinds of vulnerabilities. And that's both in terms of our government networks, but also in terms of our critical infrastructure. I guess the last thing I'd say, and I want to hear what others have to say, maybe Ross has a good point here with the British experience, is that these ambitious goals are there for generally very good reasons in terms of the anticipated benefits to society, whether it's reducing healthcare costs, in our case often with information sharing, public safety. They're often at least potentially quite compelling. I do think, though, that you have to build in the appropriate time and effort to have those policies done in the right way. And but obviously there's that tension there between having to have an ambitious goal like what you just described, and then saying, but do we really have the security in place to do that? And if we don't, maybe we should, think about either moving the goal or adjusting it.
Okay, well, let me add something to that. People generally think of security risk as leading to or implicating privacy risk if there's PII involved. But it actually goes in the other direction sometimes as well. PII can be incredibly useful if you want to leverage it for a social engineering attack. And we know there have been instances where adversaries have, as a first step, taken advantage of security weaknesses to get access to PII, but they're actually not interested in the PII per se. What they're interested in is leveraging the PII for a social engineering attack so they can get what they really want, which is typically some kind of sensitive information that has actually not much of anything to do with individuals per se.
Well, I would echo what Tim has said. I think that as the world becomes more interconnected, the national security establishment has to have a broader scope, and it mustn't see its duty solely as protecting defense and intelligence personnel because of the connectedness of the world. Now, if I were a foreigner and my mission were to suborn people in the NSA or its key contractors, one of the first places that I would start looking would be their medical records. If you know who's an alcoholic or a drug addict or has HIV or whatever, that gives you the beginnings of a target list.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think those kind of vulnerabilities we're uniquely sensitive to. And, it's interesting. You proposed something that has been the subject of a lot of debate. For many decades, NSA's information assurance mission has been limited and will, I expect, remain limited to national security systems, that is, military and intelligence systems. There has been a lot of discussion and a lot of policy debate about the DHS role in protecting critical infrastructure and civilian networks, and the most sort of sensitive part of that is how closely NSA will work with DHS in providing the expertise. And the answer so far has been pretty closely, but with a lot of oversight. And we'll see how that model works.
Great. Thank you all for your comments. We'll go to the next question. I will say that I had the opportunity yesterday to testify before a congressional committee on data breach legislation. This is from Congressman Bono Mack. And there were some problems with the bill, but one of the changes in the bill from the one that had been passed by the House of Representatives last year and then not acted upon by the Senate was the inclusion of a strong principle of data minimization. And I saw this actually as a very hopeful development in the world of privacy law. And I explained that with data minimization, you are not only reducing the risk at the outset. Health clubs, for example, should not be collecting social security numbers. But when a breach does occur, you also reduce the exposure and the release of personal information. So, for those of you here who are following up, privacy law in Washington. I would keep an eye on this. The extent to which this Congress is able to understand the important role that data minimization plays in reducing risk, reducing the size of the target, I think, as the national security people would say, could be a real positive. So let's go now to John.